Let's go on to the big thing before I was born, the cross-country trip of America made by Vince and Louise Libbon.
Another aspect of our wonderful fun time together. And I know I'm beating on this to death, and I know I'm probably going to be ridiculed by it, but I've always felt that there's a uniqueness there, that we've had fun superior to other fun times, and I'm sure the next person is going to say, well, we had fun times too, but I just looking back at our fun times, I can't imagine them being as duplicated or replicated as often as we've enjoyed them. And the cross-country trip was that kind of a trip. We had come to a point where I realized it would take, I was told, at least 2 to 2.5 months before we got the bar results, so I'd know whether I was practicing law or not, or able to get a license. And so my options were to either go work as a clerk somewhere for minimum wage in a law firm, or do something with our 2.5 months. And I had already decided I wanted to go out on my own, even though, again, because of Mrs. Hancock, we had connections if I wanted to go work for a large firm. In fact, we had even gone down to talk to somebody, I believe, in that regard. I did, and a position was offered, but I wasn't interested in working for somebody. I didn't want to take orders from other people above me. I've always had a problem with that. Having, sidebar,
now you
even
don't care.
got kicked
Except
out of
for-
ROTC.
Except for the law.
Sorry?
Well, you argued the law. That was an order from above you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean,
There's always someone above you, is my point.
my heirs should know that I couldn't even stay in ROTC in college, which was a requirement of all football players the first year in college, and I lasted 1 semester because I got so many demerits. I could not stand taking orders from someone who I felt was less competent than me. But anyway, that's me. I didn't want to work as a law clerk for a law firm. I didn't want to work for a law firm.
We had already made these plans, so we knew as
So-
soon as he took the bar, we were going to go on this cross-country
I was
trip.
just trying to give
The
how
reason
we
why.
arrived at
Okay.
that,
Okay.
the foundation. And so anyway, we had decided what would be fun would be to go across country, and we had purchased the van for that reason. And I was going to take the bar exam and leave on the cross-country trip with Mom thereafter immediately. So I'll let Mom then give the details of what happened.
So the bar exam was 3 days, correct?
2.5.
2.5 days.
It,
So
it was.
we only had the one vehicle, so that last day I took him to the exam,
Friday morning,
and
and it was being held.
I'm not sure if it was a Friday morning, but regardless.
It was. It was Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. We left at Friday noon, and it was downtown for the foundation of it at the convention center where the exam was being held, Phoenix Convention Center.
Right.
Go ahead.
Not the Symphony Hall?
That was the convention center.
Oh, okay. And so my job was to take him in the morning, come back to the apartment, and pack up. Because all we really had was clothes and pots and pans and stuff, because the apartment was furnished. So there was, most of the kids that lived in the apartment were, like I said, 19, 20-year-olds. But there was one couple that were older. He had decided to go, or she had decided to go back to school, and they had a small child who I did babysit for them a couple times. And he saw me loading all this stuff in, and so he gave me a hand because I boxed everything up, and he helped me pack up the van. I had the VW packed to the gills, and of course we couldn't take that on our cross-country trip. We had to go dump it with Huey. So I got it all packed up, and I pop up in front of the Symphony Hall convention
And where was
center.
you at that time?
He
He was
had gone
still
back to Los
Oh,
Angeles.
okay.
Yeah, he just came out for a visit.
Oh, okay.
He was in Los Angeles. Remember, we paid him
Yeah.
to store our other stuff. So
And if I can interject here, honey,
Mhm.
the last test happened to occur across the street from the convention center at the hotel right there, I believe it was the Hyatt. And I remember sitting there with Joe Causey next to him in the exam, and finishing the exam and walking out with him and looking down the steps, and I could see Mom, because the convention center isn't like it is now. It was just Symphony Hall and one building behind that, and the rest was open space, and I could clearly see her standing near the van on that side street waving, and I could see the van was packed to the hilt, and I had such a great feeling about being released and the pressure of that exam being over and realizing we were starting on such an adventure.
But we decided to go by way of Vegas. So we went up to Vegas, and we did a little gambling, and we spent the night there. And then the next morning we left for Los Angeles, and we went to Oakwood Apartments. I think we went by and saw my family too. Like, I don't have much recollection of that, but we must have.
I don't remember that, but we could have, I guess.
And then we went to Huey's, and he helped us unload the van, and we stored that stuff with him, and we were still paying him a monthly thing. And from there we went up to Santa Maria, and we had to sort of do that because we were going to be gone for so long, and we had bills to pay. Even though we didn't have a mortgage and stuff like that, we still had credit cards and whatnot. So we put his mom, on those days there was no internet to pay bills and stuff, so we put your mom on the checking account so she could write checks and pay our bills while we were gone, and we had all the bills forwarded to her. So we spent a couple days, I think, in Santa Maria.
Right.
And then
And Bernadette was there living with my mom at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all excited about the trip. Mm-hmm. In fact, we found out afterwards that they had...
We sent postcards all along to everybody. I even sent them to my coworkers at Disneyland because they would always put postcards up in the cash control room of people who had gone places. And she made, of all the postcards we sent them, she made us a scrapbook with them, which we still have, which was nice. And so when we were ready to leave, we took off from Santa Maria up the coast. And do you want to?
We backtracked from our honeymoon because we enjoyed driving up the Highway 1, which is called the El Camino Real, a Spanish term for the conquistadors that settled California, civilized California, and they had Highway 1, the original highway that went from San Diego all the way to San Francisco.
Which translates to the King's Highway.
El Camino Real is translation, yes.
The King's Highway.
The King's Highway, Highway
Technically
1.
the Royal Highway.
Well, yeah, but I think, yeah, maybe, but everyone called it the King's Highway.
Mm-hmm.
So we went up
We
the
started
one,
the 1.
and up we went, and we stopped in the Bay Area to visit Tim and Nancy Wells.
Friend of ours.
Tim had started law school with Papa, and he decided law school wasn't for him, and after the first year he dropped out and went to work for Johnson & Johnson, or Johnson Wax, was it?
Yeah, Johnson Wax.
Johnson Wax.
And we had a nice visit with them.
They had had a baby, so we got to see their little girl. Annie was her name, and we spent the evening with them and the night with them, and then the next day
morning,
we took off from there.
I think we cruised through San Francisco again and had our cracked crab and bread because that was so good then.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went on up the coast, and this time I think we went through the forest, right? We saw
the redwoods.
Redwoods for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, which we took you to later. But there's a Redwood National Forest. If you ever get a chance to visit, it's a wonder of the world. These giant trees, they're so big, and they're only located in Northern California, North Central California, or coastal, I guess would be a better description, but they're not actually on the coast.
And the ferns that grow under them are as big as any ferns I've ever seen.
It was like prehistoric.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Yeah, it's like giants live there.
That was our first big thing that we had never seen before.
Correct.
And then we went on through Northern California. I remember Eureka being interesting, overcast.
We stayed in, well, was that in Oregon or California, the bay where they
Coos
shot
Bay.
the birds?
Oh yeah, Bodega Bay was our
Bodega
stop.
Bay was where we
Yeah.
stayed, and that's where the movie The Birds was shot. So that was a quaint little fishing town.
And the whole trip we had the same theme. And a side note that's important, we had the idea that we would not, if at all possible, take the
Main highways.
main highways. Whenever possible, we take side roads and see what America was all about.
There was no GPS then, so we had maps, and we look on the map, and we saw a little road that went the same direction as the big interstate highway, but was a smaller road, we took that one. The road less traveled.
And another
aspect was we had a CB radio.
AAA was in existence then, though, right?
Yes, AAA
so we got all your maps.
So we got all our maps, and a
CB radio was something that was employed mainly by truck drivers so they could communicate to each other. It was a transmitter within the cab of your vehicle where you could go on a frequency, and the truck drivers had perfected it. In fact, they had developed their own language that was almost a foreign language if you heard it for the first time.
Breaker, 1-9er, this is Goldie Wang. All right. 10-4 there, Goldie Wang. This is Rubber Ducky. What's your 10-20, over? I've got Preparation H in my rear and Smokey the Bat in my back door. We got us a convoy, over. Yeehaw! Copy that, you some bitch pile of monkey nuts. Open wide there, Rubber Ducky. I am entering your mouth now, over.
But we got a book.
And we wanted to use it so that we could not only have access to what was going on in the travel world, but also to be able to contact people in that local area on it. It was like a shortwave radio.
Right. It was mostly used by truckers, but people in towns used them too. They like to listen to the truckers, and they like to communicate with the truckers, or whatever reason they had a CB radio.
So we got a radio and a book that would explain terms. And as it went, when we first listened to it, we couldn't understand a word what they were saying, barely. It was gibberish to us.
You were supposed to have a handle, so he was Captain Kirk and I was Spock.
But we didn't.
Sounds kind of reverse.
We didn't even know that until further, and it was only about a third into the trip that we started picking up words. And by the time we got, I'm jumping ahead, but this is important to the CB story. By the time we got to the East Coast, we were beginning to understand it and occasionally commenting to the comments. The driver.
I think we were in the Midwest when that happened, because that's when you became a front door. Yeah,
no, it was on the way back that we became
a
front door, honey.
Okay.
If anything, you should have been Sulu and Chekhov.
I'm trying to depict how difficult this language and how unique it was. So, finishing my story, if I can, real quickly. By the time we got to the East Coast, we could probably understand, and we were venturing out by saying a few comments. We knew, for instance, Smokey on the side meant Smokey at the 4-8 meant that there was a police waiting at the 48 mile post, stuff like that. But by the time we started heading back towards Arizona, we were getting so adept at it that through the state of Texas, we actually led a caravan of trucks, and we had developed our handles at that time because we knew if we were going to be a part of the process, we had to have a handle. So I was Captain Kirk and she was Spock, and that's where the handles developed. And through Texas, we led about a 20 truck caravan through it, and it's important to lead because you're the lead vehicle to point out where the Smokies are, which were highway patrol. And
one of the truckers said, "Go ahead, Captain Kirk, you're the front door."
And Mommy said, "We got a Smoky on the side about the 2-4 mark." Something like that. We were getting very good at it.
Yeah.
By the time we got back to Phoenix, we were a CB.
We never listened to the radio on that trip because we were too busy listening to the CD, because it was very CB radio, because it was very entertaining. Listen to them. They all talking and stuff.
You went in the middle of the 70s, the golden age of classic rock, and listened to CB radio on your trip.
At first, we sometimes had the radio on, but then it was like we missed hearing the truckers. But we'll tell you more about that as we go on this trip.
But one of the other side aspects of the CB radio, which I
was going to get into that.
Okay, go ahead. I think this is the time to say it, because
there was always locals that had CB radios in these smaller towns, because a lot of them, it was their entertainment. It was the old ham radio that a lot of people used to have, and this was the new thing, the CBs. So they like to listen and communicate with people. So it came in quite handy, because we'd pull into towns and we'd say, "We need a local. Is there any locals out there?" And we get somebody, "Yeah, I'm a local." And
Is there any locals out there?
Yeah,
that was the term.
That was the term.
And that's how you said it.
And they'd say, "Yeah, well, there's a local here," and we'd say, "Well, we're here now. We want to know where
we're passing through in the next half hour,
and we want to know where there's a good place to eat." "Oh, I can tell you that, the Ma's Kitchenette on someplace where we never stop."
We're looking for Italian food. There's a good Italian restaurant in this area. And
Or
we'd get
good
something
food.
like
We
that.
had the best restaurants because the locals always told us where to go.
And the first time this came into play, if I can go back to where we are on our trip, is when we entered Oregon. And that morning after we left Eureka, I believe, Bodega Bay of Eureka, we got into Coos Bay, which is on the south corner of Oregon, and we started up the coast of Oregon, and we had heard so many fabulous things about how beautiful the Oregon coast was on Highway 1, which now extended all the way up through Washington. But it was fogged in, and it was like about 9, 10 in the morning, and we didn't know whether to continue in the fog or adjust our trip, and that would make a big circumvent of the whole United States.
And may I interject here? We didn't really know when we were going to turn east. We said, well, should we go all the way up to Seattle? Should we go through Oregon and then go across? We weren't really sure. So
and
go
every
ahead.
night we'd sort of plan out, looking at our maps and saying, well, we'd like to see this, like to see this. But in any case, we had planned on going up the Oregon coast further, but the fog was bothering us. So we asked for a local out there, and our question was simply, how long does this fog last this time of the year on the coast? And the answer was, well, you can pretty much assume it's going to last until at least mid-afternoon. And we
Maybe
saw,
all day.
Maybe all day. And
See,
we saw
we-
no reason to drive through fog because we couldn't see anything.
Yeah, and being from Southern California, of course, it's foggy there in the morning, but it burns off. So we were saying, well, does this burn off and we're going to be able to see the coast, or are we going to be looking at fog all day? If we're going to look at fog all day, we might as well turn east.
So that was an aspect of the CB radio that was really beneficial. We got a lot of good tips, not only in eateries or places to stay or visit, but roads and where to go on roads. And that was the first experience we had that this is a great idea we got, having the CB radio. So we headed east at that time.
Yeah, we said, well, we might as well turn east. So we did visit the two universities there.
Yeah, we went, no, not both, just Eugene. We went through the University
The
of
Ducks.
Oregon, the Ducks.
The Ducks, that's right.
And we spent a little bit there because it was a college campus, and,
It was
and
beautiful.
I had known Steve Prefontaine, who had gone to Oregon, and we wanted to see what it looked like. It was famous for its track athletes, so it was, I was partial in that way to seeing it. It was
Plus,
just
I wanted to get a
beautiful.
pair of shorts that said duck across the butt,
Which you did.
which I did.
It was their colors, green and yellow or whatever they were. There's a ducks across the rear
You
end.
didn't want? Did you get a one that says beaver across the
No,
front?
because we didn't go to the
We
Beavers,
didn't go
but
to
that would have been
State
funny.
Corvallis, no. But we headed east through Eugene, and
Bend.
my impressions of Oregon was that it was absolutely beautiful state all the way through, and it's so diverse. It reminded me of California. It had the coast that was so beautiful, although it wasn't the sandy beaches. But heading east,
Green
it had
and
the
wet.
greenery and wet and rivers. And further east, it turned into an area of sand dunes, and then farmlands, and then we reached the Idaho
Not
border.
as much rain in central Oregon. We went through Bend, Oregon.
Yeah. Those are some of the towns we went. The impressions were that Oregon was absolutely beautiful, and the next big stop, aside from, well, we should say that we would stop in camping areas primarily, and every third or fourth day we'd actually get a hotel room so we could shower and sleep in a normal bed. But at that time we were so much younger and so much lighter that sleeping in the back of the van was a piece of cake, and we enjoyed it.
There was,
But we
the
got to
mattress
smelling, so we'd stop and shower.
The mattress was about this thick. It wasn't very comfortable, but when you're young, you can tolerate that. There were some camping grounds that had showers,
Yes.
but we wanted to get a hotel where you could, watch a little TV and stretch out in a real bed. And about every third or fourth day, like he said, we do that.
Then we started developing after we stopped in Boise, Idaho, and saw how beautiful the capitals were, a trend of seeing the capitals of the states as much as we could and comparing them.
In fact, we spent, how many nights did we spend in Boise? Was it 2 or 3?
But at certain points it was required, we felt we needed to stay more than just a stopover, stay a couple days, because it was either so interesting or because we were so worn out that we needed to be able to get out and stretch and walk
And you didn't
around.
make it all the way up to Washington?
No, we did not. So we
what-
went directly east from Oregon,
Over the
across
Snake
Oregon
River.
to-
What was the most beautiful capital you saw there?
of all the capitals we saw, Boise turned out to be, aside from Washington, D.C., one of the prettiest, and it was a replicate of Washington, D.C. But Boise City itself, which got us to stay there for a couple days, was so beautiful.
Oh, it had creeks running through the town. It was just gorgeous.
And it had a situation where we were on one edge of the town, and the other edge of town was about 5-8 miles this way, but you could see from our hotel room the other edge of town, and the whole inside was a grassy, nice little park area with the town on both sides of it. It was really unique. And at the one end was the Capitol, and we were at the other end with the hotels. Plus, we wanted to sample the famous Idaho potatoes that we had heard about too.
Well, you didn't tell them about going across the Snake River and the Oregon Trail.
Well, the Oregon Trail didn't come until we came into Nebraska. We saw that.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, the Snake River
I thought
is a famous river.
it started right at the Snake River.
Well, actually, it starts back east and goes all the way to the coast. The Oregon Trail. But no, it didn't start at the Snake River.
Oh, okay.
Snake River is famous because
It was beautiful.
and it was mentioned in movies. The Robert Mitchum movie, River of No Return, and Captain Knievel. Whatever,
No.
Evil Knievel
Eva
made his
Knievel.
Captain
famous,
Knievel.
Evel Knievel
He
did
was a
his famous
daredevil.
motorcycle jump over the Snake River.
which was really just a rocket with a parachute attached to it, and he only went halfway, and the parachute came down, and it wasn't a great daredevil stunt, in other words. But the Snake River was famous. The River of No Return was one of my favorite movies, Western movies, and yeah, Snake River. We saw a lot of famous places. Snake River was one of them. Boise was our first stop.
Not first stop.
First
Capital.
extended
Well,
stop.
Extended stop. So we hated to leave there because it was so beautiful, but we knew we had to move on.
So we went across Idaho, and we stopped the next night at a beautiful place. Another magical turn of event was the whole trip was magical, again, just like the honeymoon. We stayed in a place called Idaho Falls, and we had such a great placement of our van, which occurred often on our trip, where we literally backed into a parking lot right where the falls cascaded over. And across the falls was the Mormon temple, which was lit up at night. So we went to sleep and fell asleep to the sound of the falls with our windows open and seeing the Mormon temple all lit up behind that. Remember that? Such a beautiful place.
The VW van, you could open up the back and it had a screen type thing so bugs couldn't get in. So that's what we did. But the funny thing is we were woken up in the middle of the night by people coming out of the restaurant that were intoxicated. And they were making a lot of noise, but they didn't bother us. In those days, you could do stuff like that. Nowadays, the cops would probably come by and make you move. But
And that's how we handled the sleeping arrangements. When it got time to sleep, we either looked ahead on the map for our AAA campground or just pulled into a parking lot and stayed there. In Ohio, we stayed on the Columbus, Ohio State University, right next to the stadium in the
we just pulled in the
lot.
parking lot and slept in the parking lot.
It was a nice way of traveling because you didn't have the cost and you could literally stop anywhere. In Niagara Falls, we parked along the street and stayed there. But anyway. Craters of the Moon, Idaho City, was it? You remember that?
Nope.
We had already through Oregon been delighted with all the new stuff and interesting places that we had never even imagined seeing. And we went into Idaho, and the thrill was not lessened at all. We came across a place on our trek across Idaho towards Yellowstone, a place called Idaho City, and they had a national monument there, so we decided to drive up and see it. And it was actually where the astronauts were training for the moon landing. And they chose that place because it looked so much like the moon. Remember it now?
Yes.
With the craters and all the volcanic rock. It was just the most desolate place you'd ever believe. Nothing growing anywhere for miles, and found it very interesting. Can we see something besides
So we made it into...
After Idaho, we went into the Yellowstone Rocky Mountains area and stayed in Yellowstone for 2 days, I think, at least 2 days.
In those days, you didn't need reservations. We went into the park, And as long as you left something in the campground, people respected that was reserved. So we had a TV tray. Remember, we used to use a TV tray. And so we took our TV tray and put it in the campground. And then we went and toured around. So when we were done in the evening and came back to our campground, of course, no one had taken it. And
another beautiful thing about this, a magical thing about this trip that we quickly realized was that we were able to see all the tourist attractions before they became overpopulated. Yellowstone, when we visited it, was not that crowded. And what we've heard nowadays is this jam-packed people every day of the week. But it was such that we could park pretty much anywhere, and we could see the top sites, the old geyser without millions
Old Faithful.
Old Faithful without millions of people around.
Old geezer.
I took my camera. I was heavily into photography with my 35mm camera and was taking pictures all the time, which incidentally I wanted to see if you wanted to take that or not, or at least the case. But the next beautiful aspect, magical aspect of our trip was that unexpectedly we went across the divide there, not the divide, but a mountain pass, and dropped into the Teton Valley. And we wanted to see the Grand Tetons because I had heard about them in
Jackson Hole,
Wyoming, and a former girlfriend of mine,
Jody,
whose name shall not be mentioned, had gone there and talked about it. So I wanted to see the beauty that she talked about it, and it was absolutely beautiful. The Grand Tetons were named for its main peak, which is a French word for big tit or giant tit, which the French fur trappers had named it because the peak was shaped in the...
It's shaped like a breast with a nipple on top.
Anyway,
and
it was such that it was so uncrowded when we went through, and it was so perfect with our van that we backed up into a lake called Crystal Lake with no one around, and again opened the van and had the view of this beautiful crystal clear lake with the Grand Tetons in the background.
No one around.
No one around. We barbecued hot dogs, I think, that night.
Probably.
And had hot dogs and looked at the great Grand Tetons. We had some fabulous pictures, again, of that we still have. And stayed that night in the Grand Tetons, left there, and I think the next big state was Nebraska when we crossed the Oregon Trail. And I've got a picture of the Oregon Trail at that point, too. The famous Oregon Trail, for posterity's sake and the grandkids' sake, that the early settlers came across when they were moving from the east United States, settling into the west. It was a covered wagon trail.
There was one landmark called Chimney Rock.
What's one of the landmarks, or many landmarks?
Right, but this was one that you could see from many miles away, and so the wagon trains knew they were going in the right direction. They kept that in their view. And the neat thing about that...
what did you call it? Chimney Rock. Yeah.
Chimney Rock. And the neat thing about it, it was made of that limestone kind of stuff, so you could ride in it. And people back that were taking the wagon trains would leave messages there, sometimes for people that they knew were coming behind them.
But most importantly, it was gave hope to the wagon travelers that when they saw that leaving St. Louis, Missouri, and that was the first major landmark that they knew they were on the right way, and it was something that right next to it, not too far away, was a cliff where they would sign their names.
Right on the Chimney Road. Unfortunately, they had to put a chain link fence around it because people had started
desecrating
it. So they did preserve it, which was nice. But, people would say, leave messages for people they knew were coming behind them. It was kind of interesting. And it was about that time that we found out Elvis had died.
He died in August, yes. It was...
of all the big historical U.S. events, that's the one that struck you, and you mentioned without any prompt from me.
That's right.
Elvis died.
That was a big deal.
Elvis.
That was 1977. We were going across country, and we were somewhere in the Midwest on not 40, but what's the I-80, is it? Interstate 80? The one that runs through Nebraska and...
Can't remember.
And we were just about in that area, somewhere near Nebraska. And usually we didn't have the radio on because we were so into the CB, like we had talked about. And for some reason we did have the radio on. I think you wanted to catch a little news or something, and we heard that Elvis had passed away, and it was shocking.
Shocked everybody at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Why was
He
that?
was the king. Everybody knew of him from the 50s, out of the 60s, into the 70s. He was
And he still had a
everything.
lot of
most
female,
popular celebrity.
even when he got, later in
Old
his
and
life.
fat.
Yeah, older, and he quite heavy. He still had the women flock into his concert. They were mostly middle-aged women like he was, but they were in love with him all those years. So that was a sad day.
He affected all of America because of the different generations that grew to know him and accept him and love his work, from the Las Vegas senior citizens who went to see his shows when he was fat and bloated and towards the end of his life, and the early 50s when he was getting everybody who was the generation before him all upset because he was moving his hips too much.
And he had those sideburns. That was considered wild back then. But he was one of the first white people who sang black music. Let's call it like it was.
You mean
They
stole
can-
black people's songs?
Yeah, which they called black music back then, but it was the start of rock and roll and everything. Soul, rock and roll, blues, all came from the black culture.
Probably the only one that would be comparable to him would be Bob Dylan, as far as how he reshaped rock and roll.
Oh.
And of course, the adults at the time couldn't understand. Their teenagers were so enthralled with that type of music, and they didn't even touch each other when they danced.
But larger in scope was Elvis, because he went not just music, but he went into acting and theater shows and the whole bit.
If you can call it
He had
acting.
hits
Yeah.
over a 30-year span.
He made many, many movies, and they were all basically the same. There was always two girls after him, and there was always a fist fight, and he was always some kind of entertainer, or not necessarily always an entertainer. He was a race car driver with Anne Margaret in the Vegas one.
He was a cowboy in a couple of movies.
And his first one, Love Me Tender, he was a farm boy. And then Jailhouse Rock.
And they always had his music during the movie.
But those string like Girls, Girls, Girls and Blue Hawaii and all those, it was kind of the same type of thing.
Kind of like what Judy Garland and
Yeah.
what Mickey Rooney were doing.
Mickey Rooney, right.
One movie after another that was identical in plot.
Yeah. During that era, it was era.
During that era.
It was pretty much the same. And there was always two girls in it, and one was a nice girl and one was not a nice girl. And the not nice girl was always trying to cause trouble because she really liked Elvis, but Elvis really liked the nice girl, and there was always misunderstandings, and somewhere along the way he'd get in a fist fight. There'd be a lot of singing, a lot of wiggling the hips, a lot of dancing, girls in their little fringe. That was big then, those little fringe.
My impression of Nebraska was not favorable other than the historical markers. It seemed flat and overcast for summer and not much to it, but we did see some great historical markers. I remember
The other one was something Bluff.
I remember having lunch up at the top of Scotts Bluff,
Scotts Bluff.
which was a famous historical marker, and I'm trying to remember why. I think it was because of the view that it gave westward towards.
And
where
people wrote in that too,
Yeah.
on those cliffs too. They've left messages for people.
Yes, they left it on Independence Rock as well, and Devil's Peak, and not Devil's Peak, Devil's Pass.
Right.
So from Nebraska, I believe we went then into Iowa, and we actually stopped in the capital of Nebraska and got our impressions of Omaha. And,
We always toured the capital.
and or at least drove by it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next state was Iowa, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't know.
And there we stopped and visited a former college friend of mine, Dave Keene, who we had nicknamed Iowa, and his family had a farm there, a large farm, and we stayed there with them.
Well,
didn't
we were looking forward. Well, we always wanted to try things that we knew the state was famous for, like Idaho with the potatoes, and Iowa. We were looking forward to the corn,
Right.
and so we got there. So we said, "Well, we want corn." And he says, "Well, unfortunately, corn isn't in season right now." So we never got to try the corn.
A couple of interesting anecdotes from the tour that David gave us of his farm were first the marijuana plants or the hemp plants.
Yeah.
And apparently the story was that during the World War II, the government had authorized these farmers in certain sections of the Midwest to grow hemp for making ropes that were needed in the war. And so they developed a strain of marijuana that did not have the chemical ingredients of THC in it that would give the hallucinogenic or the highs from it, but it was merely there for the strength of the hemp. And we were amazed because being from the 60s and 70s, we knew all about marijuana, that you could have actually marijuana plants, because we saw them and they were like 8-9 feet high. We said, "Those are marijuana plants, Iowa." And, yeah, but you can smoke all you want. The only thing you're going to do is get a cough. There's nothing to it.
They weren't growing those anymore, but because the seeds would fall off, they'd come back. And he said once in a while the authorities would come by and say, you need to cut those down, even though they weren't really had no potency to them. But the interesting thing, if I may say, was that's the first time I got to know about cows.
That was another little silly, little bit funny thing.
So David Keene says, "Oh, cows are very, very curious animals." And we said, "Oh, really?" He goes, "Yeah, come here." And there was all these cows sitting around, standing around. And he says, "Let's just go in this shed over here."
No, you did something with a stick first, didn't you?
No, he did that afterwards.
Okay.
So he said, "So let's just go in this shed and you'll see." So we go in the shed and we're standing there, and pretty soon one cow sticks its head in. They're curious. They want to see what you're doing. You went in the shed. What are you doing in there? And pretty soon one cow's head, and then another cow's head, and then another cow's head. And they're all coming over. "What are you guys doing in there?" And so I thought that was hilarious. And he says, "And watch this." So we went back out, and they're all standing there in a herd. And he picks up a stick, and he goes, And the whole time he's doing that, the cows' heads are going. They're following this stick around, and that's when I fell in love with cows.
The other funny thing I can remember from that visit with Dave was that I remarked how flat Nebraska was, but I said, "God, Iowa looks even flatter than Nebraska. There's nothing to it except fields and fields, flat fields." And he said the highest elevation in Iowa is 242 feet, and it's a compost pile.
The state compost pile.
That's the highest elevation in Iowa. Remember
Shit
that?
Mountain. All right, so we left off in a different state, in a different city,
We're
at
down
a different
Denver.
time. We left off with you guys on a farm in Iowa. Where did you, on your cross-country road trip, shortly after getting married? Where did you go next? Take us next
On the tour.
On the tour.
The next state we visited was Illinois, and specifically Chicago, which we voted as our prettiest city.
More than prettiest, friendliest, big city.
And we parked and had our car worked on and walked around downtown Chicago and up the top of the Sears Tower.
Yeah, we were at our 1200. Back in those days, at 1200, you had to have your car serviced. It was a brand new car, so we were at 1200 miles. So we found a garage, a Toyota, not a Toyota, what was it, a VW garage, and took our car in. And they had TV screens all in the garage, and a couple baseball games were going on. And
That's true. We did walk around, drive around Wrigley Field also. That was an important little highlight.
And then
because it's so famous.
we went out in the street, and we weren't sure where things were, and people actually asked us if we needed help. They could see we were sort of looking like tourists, I guess. And they said, "Do you need help with anything?" Everyone was so friendly, and we asked them where places were, and they just took the time out to tell us and show us, and that's why they were voted the friendliest city.
And we also were impressed with the pretty fountains, especially the Roosevelt fountain. Remember that one?
In the park? It's in a lot of movies.
Did you do anything special in Chicago?
Other than going to the top of the Sears Tower?
That's pretty
Probably
special.
not.
That was pretty special in and of itself.
Then we moved on from Chicago and went across the border into Indiana and went through Gary, Indiana.
Not Louisiana, Paris, France, New York, or Rome.
My impressions of Gary, Indiana.
Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana. My home sweet home.
It was like a slum. A lot of black population, a lot of railroad tracks because I guess the Chicago lines went right through Gary, and a lot of mills with pollution. And then we dropped down south through Indiana and we stopped and toured the Tippecanoe Tyler II type exhibit where they had the famous Indian War Memorial. And then we went east into Ohio, and the next stop was Columbus.
We went to Indianapolis, the capital.
Oh yeah, we went to Indianapolis too. That's right.
Yes, that
Well,
was
going
the big
back,
thing.
let's do a pop quiz for Mom. Who is Tipper Canoe?
And Tyler too.
Who is Tipper Canoe?
He ran for president.
No, Tippecanoe is not a he; it's a place. Tippecanoe is where the Indian fight occurred, I believe. But of course, James is going to correct us if we're not right.
You went to Indianapolis.
We went south a little further into Indiana, and the capital, Indianapolis, we toured, and it was remarkable because it was the one of the first laid out cities in America around the turn of the century, whenever it was, and they did a real nice design with the structure of the city, where they had the downtown center piece with the government, the local government and the state government, and right in the middle of the center of town was a war memorial that was just took up a huge block. You literally had to go all the way around just to see the whole memorial. And then they radiated the cities as though it were a wheel.
The streets in the city.
The city streets, I'm sorry, as though they were spokes in a wheel. And that was cool the way they designed it. And
That
that's-
memorial was like the center of the town, and all the major streets went out from there. It was really
really
quite
pretty-
impressive.
Very impressive. And then we moved into Ohio. And I remember we stopped in later in the day and slept on campus of Ohio State. Remember that?
Right by a dorm in the parking lot.
Right in the parking lot. And we had a breakfast in the morning, I think of donuts, and then we
May I say something?
Sure.
In those days, they didn't charge you $400 to $600 to park on campus like they do nowadays. That's all.
And I think we already spoke about how we sometimes stay right there on the street and sleep there, and then in the morning, every 3 to 4 days, we get a motel room to sleep in a regular bed. I think
But it was
we-
perfect sleeping on campus because it was,
But the significant thing about Columbus, even though they had a very pretty capital, was that while we were on campus, they were practicing their preseason football team was practicing, and we went and caught the end of practice because it was anyone could walk in the stadium, and they were just coming out after about 10 minutes and watched them come out, and guess who was the last one coming out? None other than the infamous coach Woody Hayes. He's infamous because he was not only well known as a coach in football back in the 70s and 60s. He had a slogan of 3 yards and a puff of dirt or something like that, meaning that he loved to run, but he was infamous because of his temper. And he one time, when an opponent was running back a touchdown from a kickoff, stepped onto the field and cold cocked the guy. And he also was known for being pretty rough with his players. And Mom was aware of his reputation.
Well, wait a minute. You forgot the biggest thing is he punched a photographer once for taking a picture of him.
Yeah.
So we approached him, and I was nervous. In the picture, you can see I've got my hand up like this on my collar. And Papa said, could I take a picture of you with my wife? And he was so sweet. He was like, sure, come on over. Puts his arm around me and the whole bit.
Pretty blonde like you.
And I'm like this in the picture.
And in fact, I carry a copy of that picture in my wallet in case you want to make a
I'm
copy.
familiar with that picture. Somewhere.
And I just show anybody from Ohio State who's an Ohio State fan, oh, you'll be interested in seeing this picture of my wife. And they say, that's Woody Hayes. Yeah, she's right. She was very nervous having that picture taken. We headed east across the middle of Ohio. We stopped and had lunch at a lagoon. Remember? They took a creature from the Black Lagoon picture of you that I remember.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
And then we got to the border of Pennsylvania and stopped in Youngstown because it was an interesting town on the river.
Youngstown, Pennsylvania?
Actually, it's Ohio, I think.
Oh, okay.
And then we crossed into Pennsylvania and trekked on into Pittsburgh, my hometown.
Sharpsburg and McKees Rocks, to be exact.
Well, Pittsburgh, but
Yeah.
and in Pittsburgh we had a very humorous occasion. You want to tell about it? Where we scared Dad's friends?
Yeah. Papa had on a black shirt that day, and he went into the clothing store that he knew his father's friends owned and worked in. And he came in and he says, I'm looking for someone named, what was
Tarazi.
it? Tarazi. And he said it like real gruff, like he was like a mobster or something looking for him. And I'm Tarazi. And he says, my dad sent me here. And he's like all nervous and everything. And then
He said, who's your dad?
and he said, Vince Libbon. And he said, oh my gosh, oh, you used to stand on my car seat and get my seat all dirty. Remember? Yeah. I'd take your dad somewhere and you'd have to go with, and you'd stand up. And
So we took pictures outside with him, outside of his clothing store.
and his best friend Sheik happened to be in there, and he came out, and they just couldn't be nicer. In fact, Sheik took us to his private club for a drink later, remember?
And
Is
had
this
introduced
the
Vince
same?
Libbon's son.
Is this the same Sheik who was friends with your grandfather?
No, this is a Sheik that was one of my dad's closest friend, who I suspect is my father. My father.
Oh, don't even say that. Your mother got so mad when you said something like that. She did not like that.
And so after we went down to Sheik's little club and got introduced as Vince Libbon's boy and his wife, we visited a couple of my aunts, I think.
We surprised them. Yes, you went and surprised Aunt Ralphie.
Yeah, I have Hobbit aunts.
Well, I'm sure those pictures are in the book. She came up to about here on me. And then we went over to McKees Rocks to see your Aunt Mary.
Okay.
And whose husband hadn't worked in 30 years, and she had to whisper that to us because I think she was embarrassed to how her house looked, and so she said, he hasn't worked in 30 years, she said to us. We said, oh, okay. So, but I guess she stayed with him anyway.
And what impressed us about Pittsburgh was how beautiful it was. We were expecting steel mills and pollution, and it was clear blue sky. We went downtown and looked at the University of Pittsburgh where my dad went to school, and the beautiful tower. We went into the tower and saw some classrooms. It's a large cathedral skyscraper right there in the middle of campus.
Right, and at that time they kept the classrooms the way they were originally, probably back in the 20s or 30s. They're all big oak desks and just beautiful. But we also went on the incline.
And then we went across the river to the incline and took some pictures of Pittsburgh. And the incline is like a train that goes up the side of the hill. Pittsburgh's located on hundreds of hills.
It's almost like a ski lift, not a ski lift, but one of those big ones that hold...
a gondola?
Yeah, a gondola. It almost looks like that, but it's on a track that goes up the side of the hill. Because Pittsburgh's very hilly.
But it's also situated at the...
Right, and you can see where the...
Earnings of three rivers, so you could see them from the incline.
Hence the name of the stadium, Tri-River Stadium.
Three River Stadium.
Oh, Three Rivers,
Can you name the three rivers?
Allegheny, the Mohican or something.
Oh, that's the Mohicans River?
Monongahela.
The Monongahela. Monongahela.
Now say sea anemone.
Sea anemone.
And what's the third one? that those two go into?
I don't know.
Ohio.
Ohio, that's right.
That's
And
easy
actually,
one.
Fort
I know.
Pitt was founded in the 1600s, right on that convergence, and that's why the Pittsburgh name came from, because it was named Fort Pitt after a famous general. Anyway, we had a real fun time visiting relatives and sightseeing in Pittsburgh, and I think we stayed the night, or did we head up into Jamestown, New York after that during the day?
No, because we didn't go later in the day, and we went around. Didn't we tour Jamestown before we went to see my grandma, or did we go afterwards?
I think what we did is that we left Pittsburgh, so we didn't stay anywhere with relatives or friends there. Not that we had any friends, and went into New York and stayed there, and then we went across what they call the Finger Lake district of Upper New York.
Yeah.
Real beautiful part of New York, all green.
We camped there.
And camped there, and went through the
Five Fingers.
Finger Lake district, and went through the town that's known as the birthplace of where the Hall of Fame is for baseball, Cooperstown. And then we went into Jamestown.
Okay. My grandmother lived there with her sister, my great aunt Dale.
Jamestown, and we saw where her dad went to school, the high school. It's still standing.
And my cousin Donna too.
And
my uncles.
Yeah, that's right. We took pictures of your grandma's original home, your grandfather's original home, I believe.
Well, my grandmother and her sister still live there, but my great grandfather built it. And all the children were born in that house except for my Aunt Dale, because she was one of the younger ones. She was born in a hospital. But my grandmother, no, actually it's the other way around. My grandmother was 2 when he built the house, and Aunt Dale was born in that house. So she lived her whole life in that house, because she married her husband George, and they lived on the upper floor, or vice versa, and my grandmother and her husband Henry lived on the lower floor. I think it was reversed though, but whatever. It had a basement and 2 floors that had full kitchens, and then an attic.
And then we went, I remember in Jamestown, going to the library, which was an old structure, and they were having a book sale at the time. And I picked up 3 books that you will inherit that I've been preserving for him. One is the Diary of Ulysses S. Grant, and these books are real old books. And one was on Abraham Lincoln, and the third one was the infectious disease book with all the photographs at the turn of the century and even into the late 1800s by the German doctor photographer that I think I've shown to you. And when you're ready, you can have it. But it's a special book, so you need to preserve it.
And wasn't one of them on Abraham Lincoln?
I did say that, I believe.
You said Ulysses S. Grant.
The Diary of Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
Anyway, then we left James.
In fact, they shipped them to us, remember? We didn't even have to carry them with us.
Yeah, that's right.
She said, oh, we'll be happy to ship them to you. So, and they were like giving them away practically, and they were pretty nice books.
That infectious disease one was valuable, I bet.
You know who would like that?
Don't give it to him. You keep it. You'll want to keep it.
So, I don't remember Seneca Falls so much, but I do remember the Five Finger Lake area of New York where we camped and spent the time, and it was mind-boggling. It was one of my favorite spots on our trip. It was just so beautiful and unexpected. Anyway, go ahead. Seneca Falls?
Yeah, it was just impressive because it was a campground, and we found all the campgrounds up in that area to be isolated and well prepared, maintained. And Seneca Falls was a short hike from the campsite to a beautiful little falls back in the wooded area. And to correct what I said earlier, it was a stark difference of what I expected in New York State, having been only familiar with the lower southern part of New York City. It was all green and lush and beautiful around the Five Finger Lake districts. Just beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we went on into the next stop. I remember is where we stopped. We're at a particular place where You can see 4 states from that position. You can see.
Called Four Corners?
No,
No.
you can see 4 states.
Not standing them.
And you can see the New York and I think it was Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire or Vermont. I'm not sure, but it was up the top of a mountain, and we.
Mount Washington?
I don't know if it's Mount Washington. It might have been, but in any case, we were now in New England, and from there we went down into Boston. And I remember the outskirts of Boston. We stopped at a famous pond.
Walden Pond?
That's right. And the famous American author who made Walden Pond and other stories famous, can you remember his name?
Walter Walden?
Henry David Thoreau.
Oh yes, Thoreau.
And you remember what Vincenzo did at that place?
Yeah, you threw a rock in there.
I snuck over the fence and threw a rock and got chased by the security guard.
Yeah, of course. You always have to break the rules.
But anyway, then we drove down into Boston City proper. I'm very impressed with that city, especially from the historical aspect, which appealed to me.
Going back, you went through Albany, I'm guessing?
Yes.
Anything special there?
Well, we saw the Capitol and took pictures of the Capitol, of course. We were interested because it was so far removed from New York City and so much more rural town, at least back then. But we didn't stay more than an hour or
They
so.
had a pretty big downtown area, though.
Yeah.
No.
But that's when we got back down to New York. We were up in New England.
Oh, you came to Albany on the way back.
Yeah.
Okay,
down
continue
here.
on, sorry.
And the thing about the New England drive that we remember taking the drive down the coast is that we passed again from a historical viewpoint where the Mayflower.
You know what you left out? Niagara Falls, going into Canada. When did we do that?
That must have been after we left Jamestown then. Yeah, I got mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
We went up into Niagara Falls, and it was the evening time, and we parked. Remember, we ended up sleeping right there on the residential street.
What we did was, I couldn't wait to get to Niagara Falls because you hear everyone who used to honeymoon at Niagara Falls, and it was so romantic. And we got there it was all 9s. We got there at 9 p.m. and at night they have it lit up really beautifully with colored lights and stuff. We go down to look at it. It's 9 o'clock at night. It's 90 degrees out, and the humidity was 90%, and there was mosquitoes everywhere.
Mosquitoes.
And it was like, yeah, that's pretty. Now let's go. And I couldn't wait to get out of there. But you're right. We did find a residential area and sleep on the street.
Slept on the street, and then the next.
Not on the street. We parked our car on the street and slept in our VW bus.
And then we went across the border in the morning to see the falls in the daytime on the other side. And then we went a little further into Canada and had bought some cheese and bread and had a little picnic, I think, with some wine and on Lake St. Catherine Lake. It was St. Catherine's, but the lake was one of the Great Lakes.
Yeah, and the thing about going, and it's probably not that way anymore, but going into Canada was so underdeveloped in the United States. It was beautiful. Everything was green. There was all this grass. And on the other side, the U.S., there was all skyrise, and it was all built up. So it was really, really different to see it from Canada's side.
Yeah, I'm getting a little mixed up. I'm not sure how we got to that spot where we saw 4 states, whether we went up there and came back into New York or vice versa. I kind of think you're right. We went to the Niagara and then went to that four states view area and then traversed down the east coast where Plymouth Rock was and the Mayflower.
Boston.
Right. No. That's north. And then we went out to that little cove, that point right below Plymouth Rock.
That's right.
Which is famous too.
They have the big rock down there. Okay, Cape Cod.
They catch codfish there. We went across after we left the area where you could see the 4 different states from one mountain over to the coast and up into the north of Connecticut, New Hampshire, in the Cape Cod area, which was big to me because of the history. We saw the bay, Plymouth Bay, where the original Mayflower landed with the Pilgrims, and they had a little nice rock designation of where they...
With the year engraved on it that they landed, and they had it under a little
And it was...
gazebo thing near the water, remember?
Yeah, I remember it was drizzling, and we decided to take the coast route right along the ocean as another divergent, or diverging, and see the actual Cape Cod and Miles Standish's statue there. And, a lot of fun and beautiful scenery driving down the East Coast down into Boston, and then went further down into Boston, Massachusetts, and that's where we hit the Walden Pond. And then Boston, we walked around the city and saw all the historical sites. Very, very pretty, well done. Right? Anything you remember about Boston?
I remember red brick everywhere. Red brick. Beautiful town, though.
Yeah,
Beautiful city.
any New England clam chowder in Boston?
Did we ever
We
get-
must have, yeah. And I know we ate there. I don't have any special remembrance of it, but I think
Boston baked beans.
we were looking for lobster because we're on the East Coast.
Yeah. We seemed to always miss everything as we went across. Like when we went through Iowa, it was corn season was already over with. We never got
Through
any
Idaho, the
potatoes. It wasn't potato season or whatever, and it was just sort of funny where we were missing everything. But I don't really remember what we ate in Boston.
And then we dropped down to Connecticut. It was very interesting going to the East Coast, though, and seeing all those historical spots just for me. And I remember a picture we took near, I believe, the Indian statue, Tecumseh, I think that was the name,
We also
with
took-
you in the rain. And you
And
were all-
Bunker Hill, we took the picture of Bunker Hill. You
Yeah.
know, wait till you see the white of their eyes. They have the statue there with that guy saying that.
And then Connecticut was just a short drive into New York City.
I remember the sayings, but I don't remember who said them. You can see history isn't my forte.
In New York City, I remember going across.
Well, wait a minute. Didn't you go into Rhode Island yet before that?
That was up above. Yeah, we went to Rhode
Oh,
Island.
well, one
Wait a
of the-
minute, wait a minute.
okay.
You're bypassing Connecticut, which was one of my favorite places with the big mansions.
You're sort of glossing over New England.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
We didn't go up past. We didn't go north of Boston, did we?
Yes.
Oh, we did.
So talk about Connecticut then, and then you can talk about Providence, which you talk with me about, and all the beautiful
Yeah.
houses and whatnot.
Yeah, I think she's getting mixed up with Connecticut. Connecticut was just a quick drive through to get to New York, but backing up a little further north,
Wasn't it Newport though?
Newport Beach, Rhode Island.
Oh, okay.
And
I thought we were
the
in
interesting
Connecticut.
thing about the capital of Rhode Island, which was the town of,
Providence,
is the capital is up on a hill. A real-
overlooking the ocean.
That's a real beautiful Washington Dome type miniature Capitol building with a dark statue on top, and I can't remember, the statue's pointing somewhere. I don't know if it's an angel or what, but it was just an outstanding
It was
architecture.
one of the prettiest capitals. I mean, the surrounding of it, the view of the ocean, all this green grass, and just really, really pretty. But Newport,
And then we drove down into Newport.
oh my gosh, you talk about wealth. Those houses were just unbelievable.
High society.
Yes, gorgeous homes, just beautiful.
We drove down the main street there where you could look down the long driveways to these beautiful mansions, and you could see, if there weren't hedges or trees, that their backyards were
Was the ocean.
extended grass and trees, and then beyond that was the peninsula, the ocean peninsula, where Newport Harbor was. And then we actually drove across New York Harbor, remember, where they hold the regatta, the yacht race, the America's Cup. They used to, but now they go all over the world holding it, I think. But that was a real beautiful area that we remember for the mansions and the wealth. That's right.
Fly just buzzed my ear.
Anyway, then we went through the Connecticut, which what impressed me is how short of a drive it was from Connecticut into New York. And you can see why people commute and stay in Connecticut, and they take the train from that James Garner Doris Day movie, where the three of them, not Doris Day, but Kim Novak,
Oh yeah, Boys Night Out.
they lived in Connecticut and took the train into New York where they live.
Well, yes, people live in Connecticut and commute to New York. People with
Anyway.
money.
In New York, I guess we didn't have a lot of desire and time to spend time there. I remember we got off the bridge, and I don't know which bridge it was, just to say that we went into Brooklyn or the
Call it
Bronx.
the Brooklyn Bridge. Oh.
It might have been the Brooklyn. It was either the town of Brooklyn or Bronx, coming from the north in Connecticut. I don't know what it is, but we decided just to drive off and go into the town, and it was so weird looking, poverty and druggies on the street corners, that we went about 2 blocks and turned around and got back on the bridge and drove into Manhattan. And in Manhattan, we basically went around the St. Patrick's Cathedral, which took us about a half hour just to go 1 square block.
Traffic was horrible. I ran into, remember we got a
For little
postcard.
Scotty, yeah.
No. Mrs. Hancock.
Oh, okay.
You asked her if there was anything she'd like us to bring back, and she said, I collect postcards, just send me a postcard. And her being a big supporter of the Catholic Church, and we were in New York, we thought she would like one of St. Patrick's Cathedral.
But other than that, we did not stop in New York.
Drove
City.
through.
We drove.
Didn't see the Empire State Building.
Well,
drove
you
by
could see
it.
it, but
City,
we didn't drove by it. Even.
Central Park and all.
No, we drove around the large square block of the St. Patrick's Cathedral and left town, but we saw in the distance the Empire State Building. We didn't see the park, obviously. But no, we didn't see that. We left.
New York's not a town you want to drive around in.
We concluded New York was a place you want to be able to spend a week or two. And we only had a short time if we were continuing on our trek, which pulls us back into Pennsylvania, and we went through Amish country, and that was real pretty country, a lot of farming area. And then the next stop was Gettysburg, correct? Where you weren't feeling well.
That's right.
I'm going to tell your little story about me looking for, you always call them arrowheads, but they wasn't Indians.
But you said there could even be arrowheads. He was looking for some remnants from the Civil War.
Arrowheads.
Like they'd still be there,
Yeah.
after 200 years or whatever.
I was like died and gone to heaven at Gettysburg because it was such a historical, well, you and I went too, James, but this was my first experience seeing it, and I was just enthralled looking at each statue and each battlefield very carefully. And poor Mom wasn't feeling well. She stayed in the car most of the time.
It was the wrong time of the month. I was having a bad day that day. Oh, awful.
But I enjoyed it. And then from Pennsylvania we dropped down into North Carolina, I believe was our next state where we...
Well, wait a minute. We did...
No, Washington, that was the next
Yeah,
one.
we went to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
and toured around there. And we spent, I think, a couple days there, didn't we? 2 or 3 days, but we realized that you really needed longer than that, even a week. We went to the Smithsonian. We couldn't even... and we couldn't even finish seeing that, remember? And we saw the other, the Abraham Lincoln but the Washington Monument to the top was closed. They were refurbishing it that year, and so you couldn't tour that. But
Sorry about that, folks.
we could see it from a distance, and we saw, who do we see besides Lincoln? We saw Jefferson.
Jefferson.
They were alive?
Memorial.
The statues.
The memorials.
Yeah, the memorials. And
basically the same tour that you and I had.
They're so old they saw Lincoln and Jefferson.
we had tea with them. And then we went down to where Washington's house.
Born. Yeah.
His house.
Well,
I don't know if he was born there,
no,
was he?
not born. He
Yeah.
was his house,
His
right?
house
What was
on
the
the
name of that town?
On the Potomac, what do you call it?
Potomac.
Potomac River.
Uh-huh.
You know, and it was interesting. And then we saw the snake.
Uh-huh.
Woo! Because it was the house, and they had all this green grass, and then the river, and you toured the house, and the little lady was dressed up like from that period, and she would tell us about the different things, and it was amazing how small the house were. They didn't put much size into houses back then. But the backyard and this back porch was huge, and so we decided to walk down the river, and all of a sudden there's...
Why do we want to go down the river? I wanted to judge whether he really could capable of throwing a silver dollar across,
Right,
remember?
yeah.
And there's no way he made it. I don't care if he had a great Major League Baseball arm and skipped it all the way across. The Potomac
Yeah.
was too wide.
Yeah, it was huge.
But yes, on the way across the grass, this big, long, maybe 6 foot
Black
length
snake.
black snake
I don't know, it's probably
slid
harmless,
through the
but-
grass in front of us. We were
Oh yeah, well I think we'll
Shocked.
go back to the house now. So, but that was interesting. And then we went to see somebody. Was it Ulysses S. Grant's tomb? We saw somebody's tomb after that. Oh no! It was Washington's burial with Martha. Remember they were in like a little shrine near that house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we went
You
to
know
see.
who's buried in Grant's tomb?
Grant.
Cary Grant.
Ulysses S. Grant, maybe.
And then we dropped down into North Carolina, wasn't it?
We did other things too. We saw the Eternal Flames of John F. Kennedy with, and
Arlington Cemetery.
there was, and his son was buried, the son who died in infancy was buried there. And that we had to see that. What other sites do we see near Washington? Can you remember besides that, those?
No, I'm not sure. James
Capitol?
Travelogue.
The
We
White
drove
House,
by the
Capitol.
We drove by the White House. We didn't tour the White House, of course, but we did, all the other stuff.
Pentagon.
Don't remember seeing the Pentagon.
You know what you forgot about Chicago?
What?
The museum there, the famous.
Oh, the Heard Museum.
The Heard Museum. Is it the Heard Museum?
no.
No.
Museum
that's
of
in-
Natural History.
The
Yes,
Museum of Natural
the
History.
one where they shot that movie. Isn't that the same?
The
one?
Relic?
The Relic. Yeah, we saw
That's
that.
where the
and it was-
lions of Savo are.
So back to Chicago, that was very impressive. That museum.
Yes, it was. We toured that and had a good time
Mm-hmm.
seeing that. And then the famous stadium, the city stadium's right across the street as well, which I can't remember.
Still
the
in
name.
Chicago now.
We're going back to Chicago, folks.
Yeah, sorry, folks.
Anyway,
And take your time, reflect on everything.
well, the next thing I remember after leaving
Washington D.C.
was dropping down into North Carolina.
And wasn't it here?
When did we get on the Blue Ridge Highway?
In North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Now, wasn't it here, I believe, if I'm thinking correct, that you ran across the first additional member of the Libbon household?
That's correct, on the Blue Ridge Parkway.
Oh, yes.
One of the prettiest
Thor.
drives next to the Highway 1 of
Yes.
California.
Mm-hmm.
They found the god of thunder in North Carolina.
They have these smoky mountains there because they're right alongside, and the hills look like they're on fire almost. And
They
lo
look
and-
like they're not on fire. They look like there's smoke because the clouds hang so low in them, and you were above them on this Blue Ridge Skyway. You're up so high that it looks like they're smoky, not so much on fire. And but it's just clouds. It's really pretty, really pretty.
But yes, we almost ran over our addition to the family, Thor. We named him.
Turtle.
A little box turtle that we saw in the middle of the road and decided to rescue and carried him along with us the rest of the trip, and he remained in our family for some time.
Many
Named
years.
him Thor, even though Thor was a woman.
Is Thor a woman?
Oh, you mean
The turtle.
was, okay.
Oh, I thought
And
he was
even
a
though I
male.
wanted that name for you, but Mom said, no, we'll name the turtle Thor, not our first child.
You almost were a Thor.
Right?
Thor Libbon. Thor Libbon.
Pretty hot
hey,
commodity
Thor,
right now.
you have a Thor thumb? I can
The
just
next
hear it.
stop I remember making in that area was the town of Ashford.
Oh my
And
gosh.
touring the Biltmore Estates, which is the eastern coast equivalent of
Hertz Castle.
Hearst Castle.
It was beautiful. And again, I fell in love with the cows. They had the most beautiful cows there. That's where all the cows are, and it stinks. These cows, though, were brown. And the thing I remember the most is they're like in a barn and you go up and pet them, and their tongue, they would lick you. And their tongues were so soft, and they had the prettiest eyes. They were beautiful cows.
White face?
No, brown.
Yeah, they were interesting color.
I'd never seen
Dairy
such
cows.
beautiful cows in my life. Their
not
coat
Herefords.
was shiny. They taste good, but they smell horrible.
I've got a picture of Mom petting them and one of them licking her.
And I'm like going,
Good picture though, throw in there.
yeah. But that place was amazing. The grounds were unbelievable. The gardens were just, even the drive up to the house were all these trees.
And flowers that were famous
Gorgeous.
were the azaleas, weren't they? Azalea.
There was they had all different kinds of flowers. The garden was one of those, when you were up in the house and you could look down, you could see it was cut in a pattern, all the shrubs and everything, and they bloom and bloom. You have pictures of those. But this house was very modern for its time. It had indoor plumbing, including a shower, which was almost unheard of in those days. So that was really fun to see.
They had huge banquet rooms where you could walk into the fireplace. It was so big. And
Yeah, like Hertz Castle, very similar.
very fun times touring that. And then I remember us trekking southward through South Carolina and into Florida and the Florida coast on the east side, where we made our way down.
How far south did you go?
We didn't go all the way to Miami, but we went where we could take the highway west to Orlando. Our destination
No,
was
going back,
Disneyland.
anything in South Carolina or just drive through?
No,
it?
we just drove through.
I remember going through Charleston because my boyfriend from high school, mother was born and raised there. And this is our grandpuppy right here. I don't think you can see her.
No, you can't.
Oreo. How's my girl, huh? How's my girl?
And then the next stop, the big stop, was Orlando, where
We went to Disney
we
World.
went to Disneyland World, and Mom chewed out an employee because he was not what Walt Disney envisioned of the employees for Disney.
It was a female and she was very rude. It was in the parking lot. And I told her she didn't have good training because...
Well, the whole story is, first I believe it was a male, and you know how they direct you to parking spaces in Disneyland, and we were directed to a spot, and as we were getting out of the car, this attendant was in an argument with a customer who was parking his car, and we don't know what the argument was about, but Mother, because of her years of loyalty as a true blue employee
Disney
of
employee.
Disney, and Walt Disney even held her on her lap or something like that. His lap.
Patted me on my head.
I reached into his
Laid
pants
into
pocket.
this employee saying, Walt Disney would never allow that to happen. You should be ashamed of yourself, and you shouldn't be yelling in arguments with customers. And
Not customers.
I
Guests. They're not
Guests.
customers, they're
I'm
guests.
just backing off saying, I don't know this woman. But
I
that
just
was-
told him that he wasn't he wasn't Disney quality.
And then we toured the park, of course, and we weren't as impressed with it as we were Disneyland because it was.
It wasn't
First
as
of all,
quaint.
Main Street was built to scale, whereas Main Street in Disneyland is 2/3 or 3/4 scale.
Yeah, but Disney World is what Disney actually envisioned for his park.
Right.
He's
Right.
limited in his space in
Now you have to
California.
remember this was 1977. Now that area is so built up with all the other things around it.
Kingdoms.
The Epcot wasn't there when we toured. Universal Studios, all the water parks, none of that was there.
It's still all owned by.
Right, and so it was, just out there all by itself, and it just didn't. We had a good time, but it wasn't the quaintness that Disneyland was.
The castle was full scale, for instance.
And Main Street.
Well, maybe you're the one who didn't realize what Disney's vision was.
No, I did, because
Quality.
they told you all that when you had to go to their little rah-rah meetings at Disneyland.
Right.
So I knew all that, but Disney hated the area around Disneyland. He hated all those little cheap hotels and stuff that went up. And so when they decided to build this one, they made sure they bought enough land that they could control the hotels around it. And that's why now at Disneyland, they have the 3 hotels right in the park.
Yeah.
And I remember the impression when we came to Disneyland, Disney World, and left. You had a choice after you left the parking lot, either to take the monorail into the park or take the ferry, paddleboard ferry, into the park. And so we took the monorail into the park, which actually went through one or more of the hotels. And then when we left, we took the Mark Twain type, what kind of paddle boat?
It was just a ferry.
And I remember got a gorgeous picture of the sunset with the Disney World in the background from that boat. Real nice picture. But those are 2 impressions I had also, Disney World. And then the next big adventure was the Love Bugs, which Mom can tell you about.
So you make your way back up into Alabama?
Well, no, backing up, when we left Disney
That's
World,
when...
we encountered the Love Bugs. We were told by the locals were part of Florida at that time of the year.
They're mating. That's why they're flying. They mate midair while they're flying. But there's so many of them that literally a half hour after driving out of Orlando area, we had to stop because we couldn't see out of our windshield anymore.
They were just swarms that you had to drive through. And the worst part of them was the stench.
They got into the vents because in the VW van, the vents were right in front, so we could smell them. Oh, it was awful.
And 3 or 4 car washes and watering out later, it still smelled. It took months to get that smell out of the car. But that's what I remember about Florida. Besides, it was very swampy as we went up the western coast of Florida.
See any alligators?
No.
No, but you know, about this time, it was starting into September. Labor Day was done. So most of the schools were back in session. So we were at the tail end of the summer at Disney World. And then when we started going on the Gulf Coast, all these little places that they had, you could tell, for families to come on the coast to vacation, and little playgrounds and little small amusement parks were all empty and deserted because everyone was back in school. So that was kind of nice because we didn't have crowds, but it was nice driving along the coast. The Gulf Coast was beautiful.
My last impression of that northwestern corner of Florida was how the trees were growing out of the swamps, the marshes, dead but not growing, I guess. They were just fixated in there. And then we hit the Gulf Coast, and my big impression of that was how it went out a good half mile of only about a foot deep water where you could walk out there all the way, and long, remember that? Beaches. Then we hit,
That's what I was talking about.
Now you're in the deep south.
Now we're in Alabama, and the next city we drove through that next day was Mobile. We went across the bridge in Mobile with all the Navy ships. It must be a Navy headquarters of some kind. There was a lot of big ships coming in from the Gulf Coast as well as military ships.
I remember those wood things coming out of the sand on those beaches.
We took pictures of,
We took pictures of, and it seemed like that it was so different from the coast, the Gulf, because the water stayed shallow for so far out, or if you want to say so far in.
Very profound of you to say that.
It was
very
really
pretty.
Yeah.
Now we're in the deep south. Right?
So you're 2 young hippies from California in a VW van
In
going
the
through
South.
the deep south, Any situations like Easy Rider?
No.
No, we did have a lot of strange looks when they saw the license plate from California.
California, yeah.
And
But we didn't
DW
look like
band.
hippies. You know, we were pretty conservative in our attire and our hairdos and whatever.
I remember we stayed that night in a motel, I believe in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Yes, Biloxi. Hmm.
And then the next morning we were going to drive into New Orleans across Lake. I don't even want to try to say it's a real long name. It starts with a P-O-N-T, I think, Ponticello or something like that.
Pontchartrain.
But it's famous for how long the bridge goes across this very shallow
Oh,
lake.
and near New Orleans?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
New Orleans.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I said going into New Orleans.
Oh, okay.
But we
Ponticello.
stopped before, what's the name of it?
Isn't it Ponticello? No, I'm
I don't
not
think
sure.
there's a K in it.
I'll have to look it up.
But in any case, we stopped before going that route because it was so friggin' scary looking. They were having a storm going there. And it was so dark, and we looked at each other, do we really want to drive into this?
Mm-hmm.
But we did, and it wasn't too bad.
I thought that was after we left New Orleans.
No, it was
It was going
strong
in?
deterrent whether
Oh.
we wanted to go in.
But I'm glad we went into New Orleans because that was a beautiful city and a trip.
Yeah.
We got these drinks called
We
Hurricanes.
stopped and toured
And
around.
I'm telling you that you could just buy a drink and then take it and walk on the street with alcohol. It was like, that's legal there. And so,
Bourbon Street. Was
and then you have that Hurricane, and I don't know how many types of alcohol it had in it, but
Lake Pontchartrain. Pontchartrain. So the big decision was whether to cross the bridge over Lake Pontchartrain into New Orleans.
Which we did. And as Mom was saying, we toured downtown New Orleans, Andrew Jackson Square and Bourbon Street. She had the infamous Hurricane drink that threw for a loop.
Mm-hmm.
And the nice thing is you can walk around the city drinking, sort of like Las Vegas at Halloween. in that
Or
regard.
period.
At least on Bourbon Street you can do it. And back then they had the Superdome operational. Now it's not. Then we left New Orleans, going back across that bridge north.
Now,
into
did you
the-
see anything else in New Orleans? Hold on a second. Did you visit any of the grave sites, any of the historical landmarks, anything like that?
Yeah, I
Or did
think
you
we
just drink
did.
Hurricanes?
No, we walked a lot down and up and down Bourbon Street and the related streets there and saw the main park.
well, the architecture was so impressive that just walking up and down the streets was. But there was some. Remember, there was those little. They had all those really beautiful buildings with all that wrought iron balcony stuff, and then in between two buildings was a little terrace area. Remember, they were so pretty.
We visited a lot of places, but I can't remember because of the hurricanes.
But yeah, we didn't spend a whole lot of time in New Orleans. We were getting towards the end of our trip.
Okay.
And we're getting a little
We're
worn
getting a
out.
little tired.
In fact, after we left Louisiana, but leaving New Orleans, we went up the central New Louisiana and had to tour their city, Baton Rouge, because it was the state capital, and we wanted to compare it to all the other capitals, like what we were doing on that trip. And then after we had lunch and spent some time around Baton Rouge, we headed west through Texas, and we zoomed. To recap on that, it was the
CB radio.
CB radio, which was completely foreign to us, the language of the truck drivers and another foreign language, and it took us pretty much all the way across the United States going east to understand it, and all the way back up until around Texas to feel comfortable talking back at the truck drivers as though we were one. And the pinnacle of our exposure to the CB radio, which we found to be invaluable. We found so many nice resting spots and parks and restaurants by simply asking the locals.
I think we talked about this earlier because when we first really were impressed with it was when we went into
Oregon.
well, yeah, when we asked them about the fog on the coast, but when we started through Idaho And we went into that one small town, and that's when we first asked a local, we need a local, what's a good restaurant? And, you know, they had us go to this nice mom and pop place with delicious food.
I think we did mention that before.
What
But
was
in any case,
some of the lingo you learned? They had their own language.
Smoky on the
correct?
side.
there was a policeman. You Smokey at the 422 marker.
Right.
Smokies, and God, it's been a long time.
We had a handle. You were Captain Kirk, and I was
The
Spock.
nickname. Yeah, you had to have a handle.
And
our pinnacle, as I was going to say, is driving through Texas. We actually led a caravan. A caravan was a long line of trucks. They always stayed together with the front end looking out for Smokies and the back end looking out for Smokies.
front door and back door.
And we were able to be the front door, Captain Kirk and my sidekick Spock.
Said, "Take it away, Captain Kirk. You're the front door." And Papa was so proud. But we literally zoomed through Texas. I remember distinctly seeing Houston in the distance, and we just sort of went, "Oh, there's Houston," because it was south of the I-10.
Yeah.
And we were so pooped by then. We're anxious to get back to our new home. And
So no major
Arizona.
stops in Texas.
I think we went through
None.
El Paso. And
we spent the night in El Paso.
spent the night there. But that was about
In
the
the
major
parking lot
stop
somewhere.
we had. We didn't have any other city stops in Texas. And it took us a day and a half to drive through that friggin' state.
Anything in New Mexico?
No, we were anxious to get back to Arizona at this time. We had to get back to Arizona
Get the turtle in water.
because we had to stop there, make sure the house was okay because it had been empty for a couple months.
We just
And
purchased
then we
the house.
and then we went through all through that earlier, and then we had to go back to California to get all our stuff, which my parents were storing and Huey was storing at the Oakwood Apartments, and move back. To
Oh wow! So you had to go on your road trip all the way back to LA and then back
Right,
to Arizona.
and so we
Okay, so and that's your trip, correct?
yes.